Good evening and welcome to Q&A. I'm Tony Jones and here to answer your questions tonight. Songwriting political activist Billy Bragg, the Minister for Communications Mitch Fifield, author Nikki Gemmell, whose latest book tackles the impact of suicide, euthanasia and a good death in the story of her own mother. Notre Dame bioethics professor Margaret Somerville, who opposes euthanasia, and the Shadow Minister for Foreign Affairs Penny Wong. Please welcome our panel. Thank you. Now Q&A is live on ABC TV in Eastern Australia. It's live everywhere else on ABC News Channel at 9:35 Eastern Standard Time. And you can watch and listen live on iView, YouTube, Facebook, ABC News Radio and Periscope. And our first question comes from Hayley Pollock.
My question is for Senator Wong. With unilateral action from the US without the consent of the United Nations, creating a strong possibility of Australia being drawn into a conflict due to our historical alliance, the threat of a broader conflict becoming a real possibility, not just in Syria, but also in North Korea, do you believe that we are acting with due consideration about the consequences of what's happening, or are we simply being drawn into the potential conflicts by our United Nations, the actions of the United States?
Penny, just hang on, because I'm actually not going to throw it first to you. I want to hear from Billy Bragg. I'd like to give it to a new guest.
Well, I think what we saw with the missile attack really was a sort of modern form of gunboat diplomacy, I think, an attempt for Trump to make a mark on the world stage without actually committing himself to any form of trying to resolve the issue. It's an intractable issue, the Syrian civil war. And for us to see the terrible treatment that's been meted out to the people of Syria by their own government, by their own president, it's caused for concern, and particularly seeing pictures of children being gassed. Of course, we want to do something, but what can we do positive there that doesn't only make the situation worse and open up the ground for ISIS to make some part of a comeback? They seem to be finally being overcome in Iraq by Iraqi forces with some support from the West. So I think it's really a question of, if the United States of America had a plan to try and resolve that issue, then yeah, I think the British government would support them. They've been a bit lukewarm about the missiles. All that's really happened at home is the Foreign Minister Boris Johnson has decided not to go to Moscow. In some ways in deference, I think, to the American Secretary of State who's going this week. So I think we worry very much in Britain about being drawn into another conflict in the Middle East. Many people protested against the last Iraq war and our involvement in that. And we feel somewhat justified given what the outcome of that war was. And politicians have to know that there is a real price to pay. Tony Blair, for all the good he did during his premiership, which began 20 years ago next month, and he did do some great things like peace in Northern Ireland, his premiership was tarnished by ignoring the millions of people who were against the Iraq war in my country. So I think in terms of British politics, I think we will think twice about following a president who doesn't have any kind of exit game plan into such a complicated situation as the Syrian civil war.
Mitch Fifield, will the Australians think twice about getting involved in further engagement in Syria? That's really the gravamen of the question.
Well, the Australian government is already making a significant contribution. It's an important contribution, and I think we should pause and reflect on that. The US response, I think, was targeted, it was proportional, it was appropriate, and it's something that the Australian government fully supports.
It didn't do very much at all. Is that also something we support?
Well, I think there are times when all of us are deeply moved by what we see, and this was something that was entirely avoidable. It was a tragedy. There were innocents who were killed, and that demands a response. And it's appropriate that the US took a response. It wasn't a response that was intended to solve the situation, but it was a response that sent a clear message that there are lines that you don't cross. None of us like war, but there are rules of engagement, and they were completely trampled upon.
Penny Wong.
Well, let's start with what Billy said, which was, the nature of the conflict in Syria, which is complex, fragmented, chaotic and violent. And I think all of us would agree that military action alone is insufficient to get the sort of durable solution that all of us would want to see, and no doubt the Syrian people would want to see. And so you would want to work through the United Nations, have the international community try and find that pathway to stability. On this specific striking question, we took the view, as did the government, that that was a proportionate response to what we had seen, which was the use of chemical weapons, which is forbidden, which the international community have agreed are criminal, the use of those weapons against civilians. And it was a proportionate response to send that signal, to send the signal to the Assad regime that the use of these weapons is not to be tolerated by the international community.
Penny, what about the point in the question about the fear expressed by the questioner that that Australia could get dragged into further conflicts?
I'd make 2 points about that, Hayley. The first is actually the point Mitch made, which the Prime Minister has also made, which is we have a very clear role and mandate in Iraq and Syria, and there hasn't been a suggestion that that should change. And the second point I'd make is this, that I think all of us should have regard to the lessons of history. And history teaches us that the use of brute force, military force to force regime change has not led to peace and stability. Billy talked about 2003, you might recall, you may not, but Labor opposed Australia's role in the Iraq War, and we were deeply criticised, including by the Coalition, as being weak on national security. And I think with the facts that history has demonstrated, we were proved right.
Margaret.
Yes, well, I mean, I agree with what's been said, but I think the other thing here is that the symbolism of that, of the retribution is very important. What we have is a crime against humanity. And so in a way, it's against all of us, not just the people who were the victims of the actual chemical attack. And I'm sure you all saw those absolutely horrific photos of little kids dying from chlorine and sarin gas. I mean, it's an absolutely terrible death. And I think it would have been awful if we'd done nothing. We'd just said, well, it's too dangerous for us, or we're too scared, or we don't want to be involved anymore. And I think your point, Penny, about looking to history as well, when you read about what happened before the Second World War or during the Second World War, I think that history of what the Nazis did tell us that you have to do something to say we as a world will not tolerate this.
Just very briefly, do you think something as egregious as a crime against humanity should be met with something more than a symbolic response?
In ethics, here comes some ethics. We talk about using the least invasive, least restrictive alternative, reasonably available and likely to be effective to achieve a justified goal. Now that's a mouthful, but what that means is that if what has been done is enough, then I think that's all that we should do. But if it's not enough, then, and I mean, let's say it happens again. Well, obviously we're going to have to do more about it.
And Nikki.
Well, I feel like that this is the dance of the shirt fronters here. You look at the date that it happened, and it's significant, the date. It was the 6th of April when Trump launched gave the go-ahead for the missile strike. That is the 100th anniversary of America's entry into World War I. That is the 100th anniversary of America deciding it wanted to be the world's protector and policeman. Trump wants to do this as well. He, of course, wants to make America great again. But is he the right person? Are we all comfortable with him doing this? I look at the Assad regime and I think you just have to tread so cautiously and so carefully here. This is a democratically elected president. He's on his 3rd presidential term.
It's democracy in theory more than actuality.
Yes. But I just feel like when we start, the rhetoric has changed very quickly to now it's regime change. When I hear that in terms of the leaders of the free world talking about regime change, I think of the all the situations in the past 10 or 15 years where that has occurred in the Middle East. I think of the vacuum in power that has created. I think of the debt that it has placed on those countries that have piled in. And in terms of, I think it's like a jihadist's wet dream in terms of, in terms of what could happen to all those countries that do pile in. So in terms of your question, I absolutely share your concerns in terms of what could happen back on home soil.
You've almost anticipated the next question, which I'll throw just to the politicians for the sake of brevity. It's from Raj Rathore.
Yeah. Hi. My question is for Mitch Fifield. If we have learned anything from Iraq, and that is like removing a dictator like Assad from power, it only creates a void and a vacuum from which terror groups like ISIS are born. So my question to you is, how confident are we with the choices we are making in Syria, and what if the situation spirals downward?
Thank you. In Syria, what we ultimately want to have is a political solution. That is the only way that you will have something approaching an enduring peace. It's difficult to impose by force of arms political facts on the ground. So that should be the objective. I think in terms of President Assad, while there may be a role for him to a degree, seeing a long-term role for him in Syria is very difficult, not only given what he has done recently, but what he has done over the past of this conflict to his own people.
Penny Wong.
Look, first, I think I answered some of your question already in my previous answer. In terms of Assad, I think it is reasonable for people to assert that he has no role long term in a stable, peaceful Syria. I mean, after the evidence that we have seen, I think it is reasonable for the international community to assert that.
How can you convince Russia of that?
Yeah, and of course, these are all difficult, perhaps intractable questions. And what we do have to do is to add our voice to the many voices saying Russia and Iran should exercise the influence they have on the regime to prevent the sorts of atrocities that we've described, that we all have seen. And to try and find that pathway to stability. Now, I don't pretend it's easy, but I stand by what I said earlier, which is I think we all know that this is complex, difficult, and that military action alone is certainly necessary in respect of Daesh or ISIL, but ultimately it will be a political solution, and the nations of the world will have to broker that through the UN.
OK, we've got a lot of questions to get through. Oh, sorry,
I just feel very uncomfortable with someone like Trump with his finger on the trigger. I doubt if he briefed your government beforehand that he was going to do this.
Evidently he did, Billy.
He did. Yeah. Well, he didn't seem to have done to our government.
But he also briefed the Russians, and they briefed the Syrians, and therefore there was no one underneath.
I mean, the Americans have planes that are flying sorties in Syria, and they've stopped flying them now at the moment because they're concerned about the response of the Syrians and the Russians. And I think that if we are going to do the things that we've been mentioning, the things we'd all like to do there, we've got to have confidence that the leader of our coalition, as such, has not just Syria's best interest, but the best interests of the neighbouring countries. I mean, we have a really big problem in Europe with Turkey at the moment, with Erdogan becoming more and more authoritarian. He definitely has a dog in the fight, both in Syria and in Iraq. And it's a very, very big concern for us in the European Union. OK, we're going to move on because we've got quite a few, as I said, quite a few questions to get through. Remember, if you hear any doubtful claims on Q&A tonight, send a tweet using the hashtags FactCheck and Quanda. Keep an eye on our Twitter account and the Conversation website for fact checks by the experts. Now, the next question comes from David Murray.
A reversal of the two-speed economy now sees residential construction in the eastern states driving the nation's prosperity. But some have likened the current housing boom in Sydney and Melbourne to a population Ponzi scheme, and housing affordability is a major problem. How long does the panel think that housing and population growth can continue to make up for mining and manufacturing? And is it time for a rethink of the generous tax concessions offered by negative gearing?
I'll start with Penny Wong because that is a specific policy of the Labor Party.
Well, I mean, we have a view, and I think You know, a fair few people have backed it in, frankly, that you don't have a serious housing affordability policy unless you tackle negative gearing and capital gains tax. We have some of the most generous tax incentives in the world for investors. We have a very small proportion of new owners of housing being bought by first home buyers. We've got very large numbers or proportion of investors in the market. Something's got to give, and if we don't tackle the tax incentives which really don't level, which skew the playing field towards investors, then you really don't have a housing affordability policy. And the extraordinary thing is that we saw the Treasurer today giving a speech on housing affordability where the single biggest area which he needs to address was off the table for political reasons, not for policy reasons.
You mean negative gearing?
Negative gearing, yes, because they want to be able to belt us about it rather than actually have a sensible discussion about the policy.
Just a very brief one. The Australian ran up the flagpole the idea that Morrison, the Treasurer, would talk in that speech about the idea of super funds being for first home buyers being able to be rated to pay for housing, or at least to give a deposit.
Well, this is the idea that Malcolm Turnbull himself has described as a thoroughly bad idea, and I agree with him, because if you're saying to people, raise your retirement savings, which is what it is, to purchase a house, seems to me pretty bad economic policy.
Okay, Mitch Fifield.
Thanks, Tony. Thanks, David. Negative gearing ultimately is a way of getting a tax deduction for an expense incurred in earning income. That's what negative gearing is.
If you already own a house, to be precise.
But that's part of our system of taxation. What we have great difficulty with is Labor presenting negative gearing as though it somehow magically solves the housing shortage and housing affordability. It wouldn't. It's something that people have made investment decisions based upon. So you don't want to go changing these things lightly. Overwhelmingly, the single greatest contributor to the housing affordability issue is land supply, is lack of land in the right places, is zoning restrictions that make it difficult to develop, is red tape that makes it difficult for housing estates, and also importantly, having infrastructure like transport in the right places. Those things together probably make the greatest contribution to the housing affordability issue.
Mitch, I'll come back to you. Yes, sir.
Finish on one point.
I will come back to you, but make your quick point.
Just quick point. Ultimately, this is a shared endeavour between federal, state and local governments, which is why the Treasurer has indicated that in the budget we will have measures where the Commonwealth can make a contribution to doing something about this issue.
Two very quick points. One, Mitch talks about retrospectivity. Our policy was no retrospectivity, so existing assets would be continue to be treated the same. What we wanted to do was restrict negative gearing to new housing to try and pull on supply. But the second point, the government never answers. Why should somebody buying their seventh house have have more tax incentives than someone buying their first?
Well, actually, once again, I'll let you respond to this because you obviously want to, and then I'll go to the...
I just feel like this is one of the great political tragedies, housing affordability, of this generation. As a mother of 4 kids, I just despair that my children will ever be able to live in the same city as me. But then what I'm also noticing around me, in terms of my peers in their 40s, 50s, 60s, there are a lot of people around me who are still renting, who have never been able to make that leap into the great Australian dream of owning their own plot or block, whatever it is. And I just think that's so sad. We're facing worlds of retrenchment, of jobs that aren't secure anymore, of situations where pension funds, we don't have the super to pay into our pension funds. I just feel like this is a huge ticking time bomb, and we don't only need to talk about the younger generation, it's the older generation as well, heading into their pension years and still renting.
I'll come to you, Will. I just want to... the Great Britain has had a similar experience.
We do have.
The Great Britain, or Great Britain.
Yeah.
The massive price inflation of housing in London has forced a huge number of people out of the city.
It's right across the country, really. I think the average house price now is over 8 times more than the median disposable income for the average family, average medium income. And this has had a considerable knock-on effect. And one of the reasons why is because people who no longer can make any money on savings or rely on a pension are buying houses to rent to people. I don't know if the second homes you're talking about, are they being bought to rent out or are they being bought to live in?
Mostly by investors to rent.
Yeah,
Yes.
we call it buy to rent. It's the same sort of thing. And obviously, as a rentier, you do get certain tax breaks, and the people that you're renting the houses out don't have a great deal of protection. This has become a very big issue. And as you said, we also have the situation where many of our key workers, our teachers, our firefighters, our nurses are having to live outside of the cities where they're working. And it's a considerable problem. 50% of the land that gets permission to be built on isn't built on. The amount of affordable housing that's built on there is dwindling all the time because of the huge profits to be made in selling upmarket houses. It's a real situation. We should be building more houses, and at the moment the local councils are not allowed to build houses, and now the government wants housing associations, and they're the people that replace the councils for building affordable housing. They're going to compel housing associations to sell their houses on the free market. It's ridiculous.
OK, Mitch Fifield, should this not be treated as a national emergency? And would you not get credit if you did that? A government often said to have little vision. A government going down in the polls could actually make a huge, impact by doing something like that. But it never happens.
No, well, to the contrary, the Treasurer, the Prime Minister have indicated that housing affordability is a high priority for the government. That's why we're going to have a plan in the budget. And we've got to look at all elements because housing availability isn't just about home ownership. It's about rental affordability. It's about social housing. It's about homelessness. You need to have a comprehensive package that addresses all of those elements. But you also need the cooperation of the state governments and local governments. As I said before, it's a shared endeavour of all levels of government, and it's something that we're going to have a lot more to say about in the budget. OK, it's time to move along. The next question comes from Ron Fellows.
My question is to Margaret. I'm 90 years of age. My wife is 81. We've decided that we will not go into any kind of aged care facility. And if the time comes where we can't take care of ourselves, we will look for some form of euthanasia. We've told our children about our wishes. They have, albeit reluctantly, agreed that that is relatively effective. Sorry, not effective, but they've agreed to our wishes. But you don't seem to be able to agree, and why?
Okay, that's a big question. You're talking about what the Dutch are now calling a completed life. And the Dutch are actually looking at extending euthanasia to people like you who say, I'd rather be dead than go into a nursing home, even though you're not terminally ill. And originally, when euthanasia was first introduced, it was usually a condition that you had to be in terrible suffering, the suffering wasn't able to be relieved, you had to be a competent adult, and you had to give your informed consent. And now what we see in the Netherlands, and actually in Belgium as well, none of those conditions necessarily apply.
Are you making a slippery slope argument, Margot?
Well, it is a slippery slope argument, yes, and that's by way of lead-in to why do I think euthanasia is a very bad idea. I actually believe that one person intentionally killing another person is wrong, but not everybody agrees with that. Some people think it can be justified in some cases. But even if you think that, I would argue to you that the risks and harms of legalising, and particularly legalising doctors being able to take the lives of their patients, inflicting death intentionally, is so dangerous that we shouldn't allow it. Your death doesn't affect just you. Your death it's a social event. It affects your family, it affects your community, and ultimately, if what we're doing in society is changing the law to allow this type of, putting it bluntly, killing, then it's a seismic shift in our values as a society, that it doesn't uphold respect for life at a societal level. And you have to have respect for life at two levels, for every individual person and for society in general.
I'm going to go, thank you, Margaret. I'm going to go back to Ron in a moment, so bear with us. I want to hear from Nikki Gemmell, who's put this whole issue on the agenda.
Yeah, look, Ron, thank you for your story and thank you for your compassion and your courage in talking about it and with talking to your children about it, because that's what my mother didn't do. She was suffering from chronic pain and she had investigated the euthanasia situation in this country, and she realised that to protect us, she would have to go alone. And she died a very bleak and lonely and desolate death, without any love and without her family around her, because she was trying to protect us. She knew that if we were implicated, if we were involved in any way, if we assisted in any way, we would be implicated. We could possibly be facing police investigations, and I did have a police investigation. We could face fines, possibly even jail terms. Mum was trying to protect us, but she was a passionate advocate of euthanasia and wanted the situation to change in Australia so that she could pass away peacefully in a room brimming with love, surrounded by love. We have so many elderly people in this country. The beautiful police officer with absolute tenderness and compassion who came to me, to my doorstep, and told me that my mother had died. She said to me, "Nikki, this is an epidemic. On my beat, I see this situation happening all the time with elderly people suiciding out of despair, and no one is talking about it." Subsequently, in terms of research for my book and all the rest of it, I've discovered, you know, these beautiful old men, they want to euthanize themselves. They don't know how to. They want to involve their families. They're doing things like getting nail guns and trying to kill themselves with nail guns and leaving trails of blood throughout the houses. They're hanging themselves on Hills hoists out in the back garden. And I've been doing some forums involved with my book, and it's so interesting, the elderly people who stand up and they say, "Nikki, no one is listening to us. Please listen to us with respect and compassion and understand where we're coming from." And I would say, Margot, I'm speaking for 80% of the Australian population here who support the euthanasia laws, and in terms of Catholics and Anglicans, I'm speaking for up to 70% of them as well.
Nikki, can I just bring in something about your story, which I understood? Okay, so something I understood when reading your story was your mother, as you said, suffering from chronic pain, but never sought any form of sophisticated pain relief from a pain management centre, which exists obviously around the country. Would that have totally changed the equation if she'd sought pain relief and it actually had worked?
Yes, and in terms of checks and balances with the situation in the Netherlands and Belgium, in America, there are extraordinary hoops that you have to leap through to actually be accepted into a euthanasia program. I know that if we'd had something like this in Victoria, you know, in a couple of months, we may get some good news about this situation. Or if we had a Dignitas, which is the clinic in Switzerland where you can go to die, it is very hard to actually be accepted into that clinic. I have a beautiful friend who is going there in a couple of weeks to pass away, holding the hands of her adult children, all 4 of them, and her best friend. She has months and months of trying to get accepted. It is very, very hard to do it. And there are so many checks and balances, rightly so.
I'll come back to Margaret. I said I'd go back to Ron, who asked the question. I mean, listening to this, Ron, I mean, what is it, first of all, we haven't heard from your wife who's sitting next to you, so I guess I'd... I guess we're all sort of sitting here wondering if Ron is actually speaking for both of you, because we haven't heard from you. So
yes, Ron is speaking for me as well. And right now, we're in good health. We do not intend to take our own health, our life, until we need to. And it's not about killing anyone. We will be doing it ourselves. I'm not asking Ron to kill me. I will do it myself. And Ron will do it himself. I don't know what you're on about, darling, about killing. That is definitely the wrong word to be using.
But it's still killing yourself.
But it's up to me.
If it's not, yes, I know, but that doesn't...
And it's got nothing to do with the community, darling. It's to do with our family.
How you die does have to do with the community.
Bullshit. Tell it as it is.
I tell you, I'm actually going to go to the next question because it's still related. We may come back to you yet.
Absolutely, we should.
That was somehow quite refreshing. The next question is from Rachel Williams.
Why do we long to be in control of every aspect of our lives? Does taking control of our bodies through euthanasia bring us as individuals empowerment, or does it make society less kind and full of humility? Is death not the most humbling experience because it is the one thing we can't control?
Margaret.
I must admit I didn't find that easy to hear that question.
Well, it's about taking control of your lives and whether that's a good or a bad thing. And I think you've just heard there in no uncertain terms from a lady and her husband who want to take control of their lives and their deaths. They want to choose for themselves.
Yes, well, we know that when something is really we fear it greatly, a response to that is to try to take control of it, which reduces the fear. And I actually have a theory that euthanasia it's actually what the social psychologists call a terror reduction mechanism. You try to make death, instead of being a mystery, you make it into a problem and you seek a solution to the problem, which is a lethal injection. But I'd really like to come back to what Nikki was saying. You know, Nikki, I doubt that your mother would have been eligible for assisted suicide.
No,
that's the first thing. And what you say about the Netherlands, that it's all fine and it's working well and there's no problems, that's simply not correct. There's a 1.7% of all deaths in the Netherlands are actually done without any consent or knowledge of the person who's given a lethal injection. And as
Really?
Yes.
In terms of all the different, the various enormous checks and balances. My friend who's about to go to Dignitas, she has to even provide dental records because of fear of imposters at the moment. It is very, very rigorous.
Well, I don't agree. I mean, we've looked
Can we stick with Australia for a moment, because we're about to see in Victoria the first legislation of this kind.
I hope so.
We're certainly going to see the legislation. It'll go to a conscience vote in the second half of this year, but there are some very strict rules around how it would actually work. They have clear guidelines on assisted death. For example, it has to come from a mentally competent, terminally ill person in the last weeks or months of life over the age of 18. So that deals with some of the issues you were talking about.
Not one of those requirements applies in the Netherlands or Belgium.
No, fair enough. We probably can't really debate what's happening there right now.
But do you think that Canada is somewhat similar to Australia? So we've just been through this in Canada, where I was involved in it, and it was going to be very restricted. Within weeks of the legislation being passed, it was challenged as not broad enough, and now they're looking at including people with Alzheimer's disease. They're looking at people who've got only mental illness, no physical illness.
Margot, this has not happened in Oregon, where the situation has been allowed for like 20 years.
Nikki,
there has not been mission creep, so to speak.
I'm just going to get you both to pause for a moment. We'll come back to you. I just want to hear from the other panellists, and Mitch Fifield wants to jump in. Sure. Victorian legislation, you're from Victoria, you're about to see the state in which you live seek a conscience vote on this very issue.
That's right.
Do you support it? Do you support the legislation?
I don't. But can I firstly strike an optimistic note before coming to the heart of that? As a former Minister for Aged Care,
No one's going to die.
well, no, no. But make the point that Australians are living longer. They're living better. They're living healthier lives. You mightn't know this, but there are currently 5,000 centenarians in Australia. And by 2050, there'll be 50,000 centenarians in Australia. We've got an ageing population, and that's a great challenge to have. But to the issue itself, I don't support the Victorian legislation. I guess for many of us, our views on this issue are informed through personal experience with our families. And both of my parents passed away about 20 years ago. And in each case, their deaths were hastened by good palliative care. And what that has left me...
So did you say they were hastened?
Well, good palliative care can bring a death forward.
That's not right.
Sorry, let me explain. There are situations where
I mean, euthanasia
individuals...
is happening in palliative care.
No, there are situations where there are legitimate care options which are presented, and a byproduct of some of those can be that a death comes forward. That's the point I'm making. And so my view is that sometimes it's a good thing when there is space in the law that allows families, that allows doctors and allows patients to manage their situation. So,
Isn't it, so just very briefly, because you are from Victoria, now the situation there will be that a request would have to be repeated 3 times by a patient, including in writing and approved by a primary doctor and an independent doctor. Are those sort of guidelines and safety measures not good enough for you? Whereas you're, on the other hand, saying that in palliative care, maybe they're killing people without really telling us that they are?
And it has to come from the individual in Victoria, the proposed legislation. That is the only person who can propose this. It's empowerment for the individual. Yes, it's control, but it's compassionate control. Humane control, because
Anyway, let's Mitch. Let
Sorry.
Mitch,
Sorry.
no, not at all. And but perhaps because this is a personal experience, I'm not expressing it as clearly as I might otherwise. But my point is that good palliative care can, in an overwhelming majority of cases, ensure that people have a good death.
Yeah.
And that's my point, is that there can be a range of legitimate care options which manifest themselves differently in the timeframes that people have.
Okay,
you should
Billy,
should never.
sorry.
I'm not saying that you should consciously, as a medical professional, set about a path that leads to someone's death. What I'm saying is that there are ways that a medical professional can legitimately respect the wishes of a patient, and that the way that those legitimate care options manifest themselves can be in different
Tony,
timeframes.
can I just comment? Yeah, first of all, everybody has got the right to refuse all treatment. And one of the examples of what Mitch is talking about would be, you're on a respirator, you don't want to be on a respirator, you say take it away. Failure to take it away is actually an assault. So you're absolutely right.
That is precisely, just to clarify, lest there be confusion about what I said earlier, that is precisely the circumstance that I'm talking about.
Okay, sorry, I want to hear from Penny Wong. We haven't heard from the other side of politics on this. And you've got numerous Roman Catholics in your shadow cabinet who strongly oppose this very idea. What do you think about what the Victorians are doing?
Well, look, this is a deeply personal issue. It's a at times difficult and confronting issue, and I think that in talking about it and thinking about it, dealing in absolutes is problematic at times. So when I listened to Margot say, you know, this is about respect for life, and I thought about that, and I thought that's true. We should, you know, we do have as a norm respect for life, but we have other norms we have to balance here too. Respect for the right of the individual to make a choice about their life. So I would support the legislation. Yes, there are difficult questions about checks and balances and ensuring that it is, you know, not used in ways we don't want it. And I appreciate, Margot, you run the slippery slope argument quite indefatigably, but I think that we should deal with the principle first, which is, do we actually think people should have that choice? I think, yes, I do, not in all circumstances, and I would want it carefully constrained, but I think as a matter of principle, that is what I believe.
Let's hear briefly from Billy. You've got personal experience
Yeah,
as well.
it's obviously an incredibly emotional experience because we're talking about our loved ones here. But I was privileged to have had a conversation with my mum a few years prior to her becoming terminally ill, in which she made it absolutely clear to me that she didn't really want to be an infirm person, and that gave me the confidence to be able to say to the doctor, please don't resuscitate her. When she was on her last couple of days, you know, and they were talking about making some kind of intervention. And I was pleased to be able to say that to respect her wishes, but I made a decision there. I made a decision to not extend her life. And it gave, I'll be honest with you, it gave me comfort that I was able to assist her to get what she ultimately wanted, because I think, Margot, what you're doing is not on purpose. You're doing this, but what you're asking us all to do is to tolerate suffering, and to put up with suffering,
Billy,
and to extend that suffering. I don't think you have a right to say that.
There
I
are
don't
so
believe you have a
many
right to say that.
bad deaths.
Just a second. Billy, I totally agree with what you just said, what you did. That's not euthanasia. That's dying a natural death.
But they could have gone in there and broken her rib cage, put her back on a machine and brought her back to life. They could have, though. If life is sacred, why shouldn't they do that? Why shouldn't they keep everything going and just keep people going and going?
There's a difference between inflicting death and prolonging dying and not unnecessarily...
But if someone's terminally ill...
Is your ethical position here, Margot, informed by religious belief?
No.
It's not? Not at all?
No.
Are you a religious person?
Yeah, I think I am. Well, I sort of am, Tony. Don't let's
separate those two things out, because obviously...
I've had a complicated life.
All right, OK, we're trying an experiment tonight, an idea we've borrowed from the Bible Society, believe it or not. Our panellists talk a lot, but do they listen? Now, Margot, you've heard the other side of the argument, so I'd like to hear you express what you believe the other side of the argument is.
OK, the other side of the argument is that everybody's got a right to self-determination, that they own their own life, that nobody else has got the right to tell them what they do with that life. And if they feel that their life is not worth living, that it's more of a harm than a benefit to go on living, they want to have the right to have somebody else help them to die, either by giving them the means to commit suicide or by giving them a lethal injection. Now, my objection...
No, I'll come to your objection. Now we want to hear from Nikki. Can you describe the argument against what you're saying?
Margot is concerned. She keeps on throwing to situations in Europe. She's concerned about... I call it mission creep because I'm still stuck a little bit in Syria and all that situation of you know, checks and balances being widened or loosened. She's worried about people having control at the end. She sees that as a possible negative, whereas I look at my own mother. She would have thought that she had a good death. She wanted to be in control of her destiny. She was afraid of going into a nursing home and losing control.
You snuck back into your answer.
Oh, OK, was I not allowed to do that? Sorry.
I just want to hit Margot. Was that a good summary of your argument?
No.
OK, no, I think we heard your argument. So, Nikki, was what Margot said a good summary of your argument?
No, I feel it was like a slanting of what I was trying to say, and it was taking all the emotion out of it. And this is a deeply emotional situation. I feel like I've been on the coalface of euthanasia now. we don't do this to our animals, to our pets. We don't see them suffering like this. I come from it from a deeply personal point of view, but I just wish that my mother had been able to say, kids, this is what I'm going to do, that she'd been not afraid of that conversation, and she would have had that peaceful death. Instead, she died in absolute desolation and loneliness. It was a lonely death, and I just hope the situation can change for all those older people out there who want to do
But
something.
surely, Nikki,
you
the
get a
answer
20-second right of reply.
Surely the answer to loneliness is not that we will kill you.
No, I'm saying that her death
she's
was
not
lonely
saying
because
that.
her
She's not
family
saying
couldn't
that.
be with her. I wasn't saying
But do you know
that.
that loneliness is high up on the list of reasons why people want euthanasia?
No, it wasn't my mother's case at all. I'm just saying that her death was
All right.
lonely.
OK. We tried the experiment.
I don't know that it worked.
Partial success. Our next question comes from Joshua Armstrong.
Hi, I'd just like to ask, as we move away from unbiased journalism towards opinion-based journalism and our ability to filter out news that we don't agree with, are we as a society becoming less tolerant to opinions that we don't agree with?
Let's start with Billy Bragg.
Well, it's a very good question. I mean, on Twitter, I try and make a point of following some outlets that I don't necessarily agree with. You know, I've got the New Statesman and the Spectator, and I try, you know, I try and get a reasonable balance. It's possible that, you know, you can use something like Twitter to follow people from a different generation completely to yours, that have a perspective that you don't. Politics on the left has changed considerably in ideological terms since I was learning about it in the 1980s. There are activists under the age of 30 now, quite a few of them that I follow, particularly young feminists who are talking about where I think is the front line of politics for the younger generation, which is around gender and things that I don't really have a background in, and the people that I meet and talk about aren't talking about these issues. So I actually find the ability to connect with some of those people and listen into the conversations that they're having quite helpful, really, because you don't really see that so much in the newspapers that you buy. I buy The Guardian. It's a left-wing newspaper. You know, I find it hard reading the other newspapers. So I actually find social media a way to bring in, if not necessarily completely opposing opinions, but opinions from people who I wouldn't encounter in a day-to-day conversation about.
Billy, what you'd sometime in the past you referred to the internet as kind of open sewer of cynicism, but
well, I do.
But before you go there,
Yeah.
The whole idea, you mentioned social media, and of course Facebook. Our fellow program Four Corners this evening did a whole program looking at Facebook, the way it tracks people's desires, the way it sends people news that they want to hear. What do you think about that?
Well, yeah, I mean, they're certainly reading our mail in that sense, which is a little bit worrying. You know, when you kind of like search online for a pair of slippers, and for the rest of the week you're getting slippers adverts and everything you look. You know, it's just as well you weren't inadvertently looking for kippers or something else. You know, so that, I mean, that is pretty creepy. But surely there's going to come a time where we have greater control over that, where we say, you know, if this is what you're going to do with our information, then we're going to charge you for it, because there is clearly huge fortunes to be made in data collection.
Can I just can I respond on one point, please? I'll be really quick.
Yeah, sure.
I promise. I think that there's a point about democracy I wanted to make, which is your question, I think, identifies a phenomenon. I think it's a problem, but without going into all of the reasons why, there's one point I think that matters, and that is our democracy does depend on at least some agreed factual basis for questions of policy, questions of philosophy. And my fear and concern is that in the time I've been in Parliament, I've been there a fair while but now, I've seen that diminish. And so we no longer have a discussion about climate change and what is the best way to deal with it. In many areas, it's actually a discussion about whether it's actually occurring. So how do you have in a democracy a discussion about difficult issues if we can't agree at least some core factual basis on which we predicate our argument?
Okay,
you don't let individuals own newspapers. That's how you do it. You make sure that newspapers are not owned by someone with a single political view.
I want to hear, we've got the
ABC,
Minister
right?
for Communications here, and, you know, the trick is in the name. I'm guessing you'll have an opinion here, but let's pick up on what Billy was talking about earlier about Facebook, for example, since we've just seen a big Four Corners program looking at how they manipulate information, how they find out what people are thinking and then feed information back to them, how they find out what products you might like and use it in that way. What do you say?
Well, I guess in a sense, it's market research in the digital era. We have always had people who want to sell to us, trying to find out what our preferences are, trying to find out what buttons to hit to get us to purchase their product. So I guess in a basic sense, this is really the digital version of that.
So can I just ask you an obvious question, really? I mean, we're the public broadcaster here. We have a prohibition under legislation against advertising. And we're always talking about the links that we have to this giant marketing company, Facebook. What do you think about that? Is that, are we in any way breaking our own legislation?
I would hope the ABC would never breach its charter, Tony.
Not the charter, it's the legislation in this case.
Well, the charter is enshrined in legislation. That's part of the ABC's Act. So it's one and the same.
I looked in the charter for the prohibition against advertising, could only find it in the Act.
Yeah, well, sorry. Well, it's in the Act. The charter is part. The charter is a subset of the Act.
Okay, anyway, there you go.
Let's all pull out our copies from our pockets and refer to the official text.
I'm right. I'm really right.
But is it advertising
I'm
or
extra
not
right.
when you talk about a giant corporation like that on a program like this?
Well, it's not the ABC taking advertisements on its own platforms, which would be a clear breach of the Act. The ABC now, under its charter, has an obligation to be digitally present. And one of the ways that the ABC is interpreting that is that it should have its content where people are. That you don't necessarily ask people to come to the ABC to get the content, that the ABC tries to put its content where the people are. Ultimately, whether the Act has been breached is a matter for the board of the ABC. It's the responsibility of the board of the ABC to determine and ensure that the Act is observed and that the charter is observed.
As a minister, you're pretty sure that it hasn't been breached?
Well, it's an area which is evolving, which I will continue to monitor, but also it's incumbent upon the board of the ABC to monitor it because they have the statutory responsibility to ensure that the ABC observes the Act.
Have you ever had a commercial broadcaster tell you that we're breaching the Act?
Oh, every day. Every day.
OK, all right, let's move on. We've got another question. It's from Kim Peed.
Yes, thanks, Tony. We've just heard today that the wonderful John Clarke has passed away. His body of work was inspirational and truly groundbreaking, and how sad it will be that he won't be able to continue it. Yeah. But I'm wondering if you think our politicians really appreciated the wisdom and the truth behind his satire.
Nikki, you might start with you there. We all grew up with John Clarke.
We all grew up with John Clarke, and I feel like, and he wasn't just a satirist, he was a wonderful screenwriter too. You know, he co-wrote the seminal Paul Cox film, Lonely Hearts. I feel like in terms of John, he united the nation in laughter, with laughter. And that's a sad loss for us. Someone like that. He was the centre of our satirical world. And yes, decades and decades of laughter at a common cause. I hate to say it, Mitch and Penny. You know, we were laughing at our politicians through the beauty of his wit. And it will be it is such a loss, such a shocking loss. But hey, he went out hiking in the Grampians. What better way to go?
Penny Wong, obviously no one was immune, particularly in politics.
He was. We did grow up with him. I remember my mother watching Clarke and Dore and explaining it to me when I was a bit younger, before I kind of got interested so much in politics. So I think it's a great loss. And the thing about John is that I don't think he was nasty. So there's a lot of political humour which is really, like, he made fun of us, but it was done deftly, and there's a lot of comedy around which can be pretty nasty. Sorry to all comedians, but I found him wonderful. I think he's a great loss to the country.
Margaret, did you? Yeah, I mean, you've been out of the country for such a long time, but do you know John Clarke?
Yes, I loved In fact, we used one of the Clark and Dorr skits in our medical school class just a few months ago. And it was the one where they talked about moral relativism, that, you know, only the things are wrong that you say are wrong. And it was just such a brilliant skit. I mean, it captured the whole philosophical concept in an amazing way. And I'm sure we'll use it again.
Mitch Fifield.
Yeah, I mean, parody is one of the great tools of comedians, and I think it's one of the great underpinnings of a robust and pluralistic democracy, is that figures of authority are poked fun at, and that helps people have those individuals in perspective. But I think one of the important contributions that he made was something that Don Watson made an important contribution to, and that is talking about the decay of public language. One of John Dawes' things that he always focused on was the use of language and how politicians debase language, how there are banal and meaningless words that politicians too often use, and he highlighted that to very good effect. And as a result, I always have a list of words that my staff are not allowed to have in any correspondence, in any speech.
Just to make sure you get the words right, John Clark and Dawes was the other fellow. Anyway, not to worry. We've got time for one last question. It's going to Billy Bragg. So this one's from Helen Dean.
So, Billy, you point out that those behind Brexit and the Trump brand of politics aren't actually friends of the working classes, and the policies they drive are actually likely to see the working classes worse off. What should we be doing to re-engage those who feel left behind by globalisation?
I think we need to help them to take back control. That was the big slogan for the Leavers in the European referendum. The idea that the individual no longer is able to hold those in power to account. Yeah. In my country, it was focused on the European Union, but really Brexit was a vote against Westminster. It was a vote against politics being done at a global level that no longer engage people. It was a vote against companies that once were the lifebloods of towns, just lifting up their equipment and moving abroad. And we need to make people feel that they have some way to hold not just politicians but also corporations to account, so that they can ensure that there will be jobs and housing and communities there for their children. People in my country no longer believe their children will be better off than they were, and that particular issue is what's at the root of many of the problems around Brexit. Although it was focused on the European Union, a lot of domestic issues were there in the mix, and I think if we address those issues we can begin to start to bring the country together, because it's incredibly divided at the moment.
You don't think Brexit was such a bad thing, do you?
Well, in terms of Australia, I think, you know, in terms of our younger generation, it's a good thing. It's a veering towards the Commonwealth, which will be a good thing.
You sound like Tony Abbott.
No. I mean, in terms of... Well, I lived in London for 15 years, and it was that glorious wave of young Aussies getting off, you know, Qantas One, whatever it was, you know, at 5 a.m. at Heathrow, going off to their jobs in nursing or teaching or whatever it was. Those numbers have been shrinking over the last 6 or 7 years. Tragically, Boris Johnson, who you mentioned earlier, he's a great supporter of more Aussies in London.
Well, you'll be very pleased to know, Nikki, that there's a plot by Boris and his libertarian friends which they call Kanzuk, which is where we deal, instead of dealing with the 44% of our trade we send to the European Union, we instead concentrate on Canada, Australia and New Zealand, which account for 4% of our trade. So this is a brilliant idea. We're only going to deal with white people who speak English. And if that doesn't sound like the British Empire point two...
Billy, I'm going to have to correct you there. That is no longer a fair description of Australia. Just ask Pauline Hanson. OK, that's all we have time for tonight. Please thank our panel, Billy Bragg, Mitch Fifield, Nikki Gemmell, Margaret Somerville and Penny Wong. Billy, that's your cue. Now remember, you can continue the discussion on Q&A Extra. Columnist Peter Fitzsimons will join Tracy Holmes to take talk back and discuss your comments on ABC News Radio and Facebook live as soon as we finish. Now, next Monday is Easter Monday and Q&A is taking a break. We'll be back on Monday, April the 24th. We'll end tonight with Billy Bragg performing an old song that highlights the impact of globalisation across Rust Belt America. The L and N don't stop here anymore. See you in 2 weeks. Good night.
When I was a curly-headed baby, Daddy sat me down upon his knee, saying, son, you go to school and learn your letters. Don't become no dusty miner boy like me. I was born and raised in the mouth of the Hazard Hollow, with the coal cars roaring and a rumbling past my door. Now they stand in a rusty row of empties, 'cause the L&N don't stop here anymore. Used to think my daddy was a black man, with script enough to buy the company store. Now he goes to town with empty pockets, and his face is white as February snow. I was born and raised in the mouth of the Hazard Hollow, the coal cars roaring and a rumbling past my door. Now they stand in a rusty row of empty, 'cause the L&N don't stop here anymore. Never thought I'd learn to love that coal dust. Never thought I'd yearn to hear those tipples roar. But how I wish the grass would turn to money, and those greenbacks fill my pockets up once more. I was born and raised in the mouth of the Hazard Hollow, with the coal cars roaring and a rumbling past my door. Now they stand in a rusty row of empties, 'cause the L&N don't stop here anymore. Last night I dreamed I went down to the office to get my paycheck like I'd done before. Those kudzu vines were covering up the doorway. There was grease and grass growing right up through the floor. I was born and raised in the mouth of the Hazard Hollow, with the coal cars roaring and a thundering past my door. Now they stand in a rusty row of empties, 'cause the L&N don't stop here anymore.
If this program has raised personal concerns, you may wish to contact one of these counselling services for further information or advice. Lifeline 13 11114, lifeline.org.au. Beyond Blue 1300 22 4636, beyondblue.org.au.
Still got something to say? Join the discussion on Q&A Extra now on ABC News Radio and Facebook Live.